So let's get started. So we have the second panel to follow on the first. I'm Ishaq Diwan with ERF and with also FDL, the Finance for Development Lab. Now, you know, in our region, we often say we have political dominance, right? Politics dominates. Issues of security, issues of preserving the regime, you know, are very important. But once in a while, economics kind of knocks at the door and comes in and becomes important. I think the last time this happened was in the 80s and in the 90s. And debt became very large, and somebody said it's not debt that matters, debt reflects something. And then in the 80s, and it reflected the end of a certain development model, which was, you remember, if you have white hair like me, based on import substitution in part. The state played a very important role, you know, was a driver of modernization. We had big civil service, state-owned enterprises. It was an economic model that delivered for a while and then got into trouble. And then there was a period with easy credit, and so money was borrowed to delay adjustments. I'm saying that because we can draw the parallel today. And adjustment was delayed in the 80s. But what is adjustment? It was really about changing a model. It's not easy. So it was this time in between that Omar talked about, the Gramsci time, where between the old model and the new model that wasn't very clear yet. And what was proposed, the menu then, was what was called the Washington Consensus. You know, liberalize everything, close your eyes, the private sector will come and take you to paradise, life will be good. But, you know, it was difficult for governments that had all the instrument of dominance, you know, civil service, SOEs, big budgets, to give up all this. And, you know, how would you adjust the politics? So it took a long time, what was called a lost generation, the 80s. And then in the 90s, reforms started to happen. IMF programs, World Bank programs, people tend to have bad memories of these years. There was economic liberalization without political liberalization, and that gave us a new phase defined by that mix. ERF was born in the 90s, at the beginning of that phase. So now we are at the end of another phase, basically. We lived, ERF with its 29 years lived through that first phase, which was a phase of some growth, you know, relatively mediocre, but some growth nonetheless. I mean, there was no private sector then. There is a private sector now, somewhat repressed, sometimes monopolistic, dualistic, you know, big firms with a lot of informality, a missing middle. But nevertheless, you know, that all the regions, all the countries in the region changed enormously in the 90s and 2000, and it basically takes us to 2011, when there was a broad awakening of the youth thinking, you know, we've grown with this system, maybe we missed the demographic dividend, we have not good enough jobs, our aspirations are for more than that. And so, you know, there was all these social movements which continued since. From 2011 to today, you know, these past 10 years were years that were somewhat chaotic, democratic experiments some places, autocratic restoration other places, chaotic, low growth, but quite an expensive fiscal policy to quiet things down. And so old problems, structural problems, were not resolved. You know, the spring came because the model wasn't dynamic enough. The root causes of that lack of dynamism were not treated. We accumulated debt over that period to quiet things down. And then a series of shocks came. COVID, the Ukrainian war, food and fuel prices going up, and now interest rate going up across the world to beat inflation. Very similar to the 80s in that sense. Easy credit, we borrow in order not to change, to quiet things down, and then a series of shocks and interest rate go up. So we're back in the 80s. We're not back in the 80s. We have similar problems. It got to be the end of an epoch and the beginning of a new one, but we're much more sensitive to social issues. You know, the street potentially is boiling, and to environmental issues. The climate is boiling as well. And so we're not back in the 80s, but we're between two periods. And so what this report that was presented by Ibrahim earlier says, it kind of puts the framework. It shows us that the debts have become unsustainable. Just austerity alone is not going to do it. It's going to be too costly. We're going to continue growing at very low rates. We'll have to spend much less. We cannot devalue 50% every few years just to stabilize the situation. And so it would be socially explosive to rely only on austerity and repression to keep the status quo. And therefore, we should start looking very seriously at the alternative. And the alternative, by the way, should include some austerity. It's not that, you know, there are less resources, so that's for sure. But try to grow out of it. And then the report asks, how is this equation? Is it changing? I mean, there has been resistance to growth in the past. Let's not forget it. So there must be some political cost to it, or maybe it's very hard to grow in this region. Has something changed to change this equation, actually? And what are the growth opportunities of today? And we list them, and we want to discuss them here more. And then there is the third part, which says, you know, we're much more aware of the social, of the environmental, and of the political implication of all this than in the 80s. And so let's take all this very seriously when we think about the future. Now, so clearly this opens a very large research agenda. The realization of where at least the oil importing countries are. Of course, the oil exporting countries at this stage are making a killing internationally, and it's another story. It's another research agenda. So what we want to investigate here are some of those salient issues that we talked about in the first session, but that you want to think of how to deepen them. And by the way, that report was followed by 6 country reports that were presented yesterday, 6 case studies of these 6 countries. And it was very rich, but again, I think there are several issues that clearly needed more thinking. I just list 4 of them here as an introduction. One is, again, following Omar Raza's recommendation. The report was supposed to have brutal honesty, because, you know, the first thing is to realize the situation in which we are. Now, you know, it's very hard to have brutal honesty when you're talking about your own country, because, you know, you're within the trees and everything is relative. So I want to ask, you know, the panel to bring out a little bit more, with a bit more brutality, the situation in which some of our countries are, and in particular, how do these financial pressure express themselves? You know, what would happen in this status quo? Bring it back, bring it to life. Tell us what needs to be also researched to understand better how this pressure comes into the system, and also how, you know, people cope, how you deal with it. So that's one issue. The other issue is these new growth opportunities. The question of why is it we resisted in the past, and what has changed that could change this equation, and what are these growth opportunities? And also, are some of them in the regional space? You know, given deglobalization, given climate change, is there more scope for regional cooperation? And finally, you know, we would all want to think about the political implication, you know, who are gainers, who are losers, and so how do we think more politically to maybe go in the direction of some of the comments in the previous session. So we have a great panel to talk about these issues. We have Adnan, followed by Shanta, and then Adil, and then Ellen, who is with us online. So let me introduce them. I forgot Hafiz? How could I? Well, I just wanted to see your reaction. Hafiz. Okay, Adnan. I have the bios here, but if I can improvise. So Adnan has had a beautiful career at the IMF. He's focused a lot on the Middle East and North Africa. He's worked on shaping IMF policies on things like debt crisis and the international financial architecture, the way we have it now. In the recent past, he is with the IIF, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and he's been very productive. You know, you should follow his website on issues of the Middle East, but much broader also on issue of global debt. So Adnan, I ask you to think about a little bit crisis, and also, you know, how crisis manifests itself, but also, you know, to what extent is debt restructuring a possible valve to reduce that pressure? And again, this is an issue most papers didn't deal with, and it's normal when you have, you know, financial fragility in your own country. You tend to not want to speak too loud about these things because it's fragile, and this is where discussant and commentators are very helpful. So let's start, say 7 minutes each first round, and then we'll have a second round where we comment on each other.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If I speak too long, please cough or something. I'll get the message. I'll take off from the summary of the paper that Ibrahim and yourself presented, and by the politics as laid out by Omar Razaz. By the way, he's the first prime minister, and I've known many who quotes Gramsci. The report essentially lays out two targets: stabilization and growth. Depending on where you are with regards to political credibility, with capability in terms of setting and implementing policies, and access to international capital markets, you can spread those two apart in a way, and if problems arise, such as due to shocks, you can adjust gradually without much austerity, and you can do things on a much longer term. You can do many of the things that were discussed in the paper and by the previous speakers. However, as your economic problems get worse, sometimes out of the control of the countries, such as due to COVID, but also to difficult international circumstances, such as right now, high interest rates, high food prices, and the souring of the global financial cycle, access to credit gets limited. You do not have that space to have both stabilization and growth. There is a hard to define point where you cannot have both. It is, in my opinion, a myth that within short periods, if you have to stabilize significantly, you can also have growth. You cannot, in my opinion and in my experience. I hope I'm wrong. And the reason I say that is, as the horizon gets shorter, the financing constraints get tighter. When financing constraints are tight, you have to take some immediate measures yourself. Much of these problems could be alleviated if The programs, for example, with IMF are 10 years instead of 3. And if the international community, including the fund and other donors, provide much more assistance. But we don't live in that world. And despite many promises to move to it, we're not going to move there very quickly. Okay? Now, the countries of the region, especially the oil importers that we're discussing, fall in different places in that spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, perhaps, with the government, with the least credibility, with the greatest financial pressures, is Lebanon. On the other side, we have Morocco, who has much more greater policy credibility, just got a $5 billion precautionary insurance line from the IMF, and the rest fall in between. Lebanon is in default. Sudan is already in HIPC, and progress was being made until recently when it's beginning to hurt itself. Egypt and Tunisia face considerable difficulties. Egypt, especially because not just of the high debt, but the gross financing needs. In 2023, it is equal to 35% of GDP. Among the countries that IMF just listed in its fiscal monitor, that is the #1 in the world, followed by Pakistan at 27%. Tunisia faces the risks of debt servicing problems, not just because it has had sluggish growth, not just because of its partial transition to democracy. It cannot solve how and who bears the cost of adjustment, but also they've taken concrete steps with determination to make their situation worse with the current policies of the government. Okay? When you start doing that, the international community is not going to walk in and give you a lot of money. Please don't hurt yourself. Okay? It is not going to happen. Now, avoiding a crisis requires not just financing, but also considerable policy credibility domestically and abroad. Most of the governments we're discussing today, not all, don't have that. A key factor that has changed compared to a few years ago is that the regional affluent are unwilling to bankroll the rest unconditionally. Egypt, others are being told by the Gulf donors to go to the fund. First, then come back. Okay? Various people have rightly said, austerity is not going to solve all your problems. Okay? The fund recognizes this. It has to be a part of a package of change, or at least a signaling of a change in the growth model, a signaling of the change in, more important than that, governance, decline in corruption. Okay? Until those happens, international creditors are not going to put money in. I fully admit, in many ways, the Egypt program of the IMF is underfunded. But nobody would put in money if you're going to use it and blow it in defending an exchange rate peg. Okay? Now, these countries, even if fiscal consolidation would help, they can't do it much because of the domestic political problems they face and issues of legitimacy, again, to different degrees. Now, what does this mean? It means that the countries, and I'm speaking about the average one, not everyone, needs to avoid default to the extent possible. However, there may be a point, and it will depend from country to country, where the growth impact of continuing debt service is too high, where the debt is not sustainable just because of the financial pressures. Debt sustainability should always be assessed in the context of the political and social feasibility of that adjustment. If there is scope for fiscal consolidation or austerity or cutting deficits, if you want to call it, is limited, and if the period that you have, the room you have to move is short, you may want to consider debt restructuring. Okay? Debt restructuring could be easy for countries that have liquidity problems. You can approach your creditors and say, let's reschedule, reprofile. Okay? Tunisia may get away with some of that, especially given that most of its creditors are bilateral and multilateral, who will not give write-offs anyway. Okay? With Egypt, it's probably more difficult and the problem is more immediate. Now, debt restructuring is not going to be easy. It never is. Okay? It's costly. Essentially, I haven't met any government that really loves to default, and I've seen a few. Okay? It is extremely painful, especially for the ones who have to pull the trigger. Now, the global, for various set of reasons, debt restructurings are going to be more difficult than they were in the 80s. First and foremost, the global official creditor landscape is much more fragmented. Not just because of geopolitics, but also because China is involved. And China is not a member of the Paris Club. It lends to various countries, and many of the lendings do not have transparent terms. Okay, so it's hard to know how much they are and under what terms they are. It's hard to do a debt sustainability analysis based on that. And it's hard for various creditors to share the burden of adjustment among themselves. Debt restructuring is also difficult because the Paris Club is become completely dysfunctional. It was set up for a different time where it was a small club run by the G7, and now the country that provides the most credit, especially to the low-income countries, China, is out of it. And one cannot expect such a large country with such a profile in international finance to come in and just automatically sign to the structure of the Paris Club. We have to remember that the Paris Club took many years to be formed. It took in the 80s many years to come up with debt restructuring plans such as the Brady plan. So it's going to take some time. Now, the countries in the region don't have that much debt to China. Perhaps there are some figures in most countries, it's between 0 to 5% of GDP. Sudan is probably around 10. In Egypt, my sense, and I'm not, please don't take this too seriously, it's about $8 billion to China. Okay, but okay. This was brutal. So, approach the IMF quickly, and I'm really speaking to Tunisia and Egypt. Don't expect a lot of money. Put some commitments on the table to create credibility, especially including for local, regional donors. And if you have to do debt restructurings, do them preemptively. Don't wait. Thank you.
I was going to summarize, but you summarized it very well. So, I mean, this is a little bit depressing, but that's what, 20, exactly, I was going to say, and on 40 countries. So he pushes the ball back at you, basically, you know, have credibility, come up with a national program, be ambitious, be credible, and the money would come. Right. Now, Shanta had, I have to introduce him. He was my teacher assistant at Berkeley a long time ago. And he gave me the only A+ I ever got in my life. So he's a very good friend. And after that, he taught at the Kennedy School. And then he had a glorious career at the World Bank. He was chief economist of every region and of the social sectors, and later of the research department, and acted as chief economist. And now you teach at Georgetown. And also, I should say, you're the presidential advisor on the Sri Lanka crisis, and we've interacted a little bit on that. Now, you've written a lot about bad policies and how not useful the subsidies are, and monopolies, and tax collection, and many of the inefficiencies. I think you kind of understand the resistance to reform. So what is it that can be improved, and why could we improve now, maybe because the world has changed, or how do you see that?
Okay, thanks very much, Isaac, and thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be back at ERF. As Isaac mentioned, I've been working almost full-time in advising my native country, Sri Lanka, on their debt crisis, which is very much what Adnan just described. And so it's almost a relief to have the chance to think about my beloved MENA region for a change in this situation. I want to take the other side, which is to welcome this report for its emphasis on growth. I think it is so easy in adjustment programs to forget about growth and say, let's just solve the present day problem. And I take Adnan's point about the separation between stabilization and growth being on a spectrum. But I think even if you're Lebanon, and let me push that, there are still things you can do in the stabilization program that sets the stage for growth, and there are others that would ignore that stage for growth. And I think those are choices that we have to make, and that's what I would, that's the value of this. Then the proposals of growth, the modernization of the state and democratizing the private sector, was that the phrase that was used? I can't resist. I have to tell you, a senior official in Jordan once told me, you know, Shanta, what we got to do in Jordan is to privatize the private sector. And I think that's what he meant. That's what you meant by democratizing. And breaking down some of the crony-based monopolies in the country. Absolutely spot on. But the trouble is, we've been advocating these things for decades. And there hasn't been real take-up. The level of cronyism seems to have gotten worse despite all our efforts to try to bring them to account. So I want to take the principles behind this report and try to cast it in a different way that we might have a chance. And the first thing I would say is, you know, it's good to talk about growth, but you know, the economics profession as a whole still doesn't know how to get growth. I mean, growth is actually quite elusive to us, especially total factor productivity growth. So I would recast that for the MENA region as trying to increase the growth elasticity of employment. Now, this doesn't fit in a slogan, but among us economists, we know what we're talking about. That is, for any given level of growth, let's try to get more employment out of it. Because that has actually been the problem in MENA. We've had periods of growth in the past, but most of it has been commodity price-based, and it really hasn't led to more employment. So let's focus on the growth elasticity of employment as a way of actually delivering on the employment challenge, so that even if we don't get growth, we might actually get more employment if we've increased that elasticity. And what does it take to increase that elasticity are these policies that we're talking about. So the policy recommendations remain the same, But the objective is to increase that growth elasticity of employment. Now then, when we turn to the policy recommendations, the ones that are listed here, these, we can present it as a way of saying these are good things to do and it's going to increase growth. But as I said, we've been trying to say that for a long time, and it hasn't gotten the political traction that you need. So I would cast it slightly differently. I think if you look at all of these, the elimination of subsidies, the increase in social transfers, or targeted cash transfers, the breakdown of monopolies, the improvements in health and education services that Omar, I think, was talking about earlier this morning, as a way of building trust between the citizens and the state. I think all of these say to me, and I've written about it with this guy over here before, what this says is that the MENA region needs a new social contract. And to say that you need a new social contract means that you have to acknowledge that the old social contract is dead. It's unsustainable, and we have to abandon it. And that old social contract, one particular feature of the old social contract was this guaranteed jobs in the public sector. I think somebody mentioned that earlier this morning as well. That has a corrosive effect on employment. Why? Because jobs in the public sector are actually more lucrative. They have slightly higher wages, but then if you add in the benefits and the pensions, and very importantly, you add in the risk premium that if you get a job in the public sector, it's a job for life. That is worth a lot, much more than what the private sector pays. And as a result, people are queuing for those plum jobs in the public sector. And what it does is that the high wages in the public sector means that the reservation wage in the private sector is too high for the private sector to be competitive. And so the private sector can't generate jobs because the public sector is paying too much. And another problem with this guaranteed jobs in the public sector is that, because you also hear the complaint that the students coming out of university aren't being trained in the jobs that are needed for the private sector, particularly the STEM subjects. Well, again, if you aspire to a job in the public sector, you don't need to learn these things. And as a result, the universities aren't training people for those jobs in the private sector. So again, this guaranteed job in the public sector has had a corrosive effect on employment on both sides, on the demand side and the supply side of the labor market. And so we have to say, let's forget it. That's gone. That part of the social contract is over. And we will stop hiring people in the public sector. And ideally, we would even reduce the number that are already employed, as countries have done. Singapore did it, and had a huge effect on its productivity. So the way I would present it, and this is a way of building public support, is to say, we cannot sustain this old social contract, and we have to move towards a new social contract. Now, the other part of it, you mentioned the fuel subsidies, the energy subsidies are just corrosive. Not only do they drain the budget, but they cause pollution, they cause climate change, they cause congestion, as we see in the streets of Cairo, and road accidents and all sorts of problems associated with it. And clearly the incidence is skewed towards the rich, who get something like 40% of the benefits of these fuel subsidies. Now, if we can convert that, but the real problem with fuel subsidies, and this goes back to the social contract, is that it diminishes the agency of poor people, because it tells a poor person, if you want to get a benefit from the state, you have to consume fuel. Now compare that to a cash transfer. If you give a cash transfer to the poor person, they can use it for whatever they want. They can spend it to educate their kids, they can spend it on their business or improving their house, whatever they want. And that's an important aspect of the relationship between the state and the citizen. It's not the state dictating what the citizen should do, but it's the other way around. So again, that social contract, the conversion of fuel subsidies to cash transfers is part of going from the old social contract to the new social contract, where you're empowering poor people to make their own decisions. Then third, the report talks about climate change and green climate, and I think Hafez will talk more about that. But I want to mention that the other big ticket item in the MENA region is water. I mean, we're running out of water very seriously. And we also are subsidizing water very seriously. It's amazing how the most water scarce region in the world also has the highest levels of water subsidies in the world. And we just cannot do this. For good development reasons, we cannot continue doing this. If you add on the threat of climate change and the droughts that are likely to come on, it is a catastrophe if we continue this way. It's a tragedy that this region has not been able to manage water, and it's purely our fault in the sense that we make up these water prices. We decide to charge water at 1/10 of its marginal cost in many of these countries. Now, I think the fact that this is a global issue, climate change is a global issue, might be a way of bringing about some change in the water management by making it a global concern. And this, Hafez has proposed this idea of a green bank, which might be to say, let the international community come in and ensure that sensible water policies are put in place in the MENA region. So this is compromising some of the sovereignty of the countries to choose their own water policy. But this is a global disaster that we're facing. And so the global community should have a say. Now finally, so these are all suggestions, if you like, of trying to sell this reform program that is pro-growth, and by the way, pro-adjustment too, that this reform program to the public. But there's another player in all of this, which are the governments. And how are we going to convince them that we need to do these things? And so there, let me just suggest something that I'm working on in Sri Lanka. So this is still preliminary. I'm not even sure I should be talking about it, but that's okay. I'll share it with you. Which is, it's a part of the Sri Lankan debt restructuring. The idea of a governance-linked bond that'll be part of one of the restructured bonds. And the idea there is that if there are certain, if the government meets certain criteria of good governance, a certain reform program with some specified dates, if they meet that, the amount of interest that they have to pay on the bonds goes down. So it's like a call option on your debt. And you put this out there as one of the restructured bonds in the new debt, in the reduced debt. And the idea there is then you get the government having a financial interest in good governance, that they actually will benefit if they do these reforms in good governance. They would actually have to pay less on the debt. And you get civil society, on the other hand, which is always trying to look at good governance in the country, have an interest in the debt rescheduling. So you're trying to bring these two communities, which have often been at opposite ends of the discussion, together. And if we can pull this off in Sri Lanka, I'm hopeful, we may be able to do it in some of the MENA countries when they go through a debt restructuring, particularly because we know that as part of the growth program, we're going to need governance adjustments along the way. And so we're trying to create an incentive for government to undertake these governance adjustments alongside the new social contract, which is the way we sell it to the public.
Thank you, Shanta. I just want to check, Ellen, are you with us?
I am with you.
Oh, wonderful. So you're hearing all these demands for better governance, more credible policy making by the IMF, a different social contract. I hope you're taking note, because Ellen is our political science specialist. She'll come back and try to make sense of all our remarks about governance. Now we move to, I think, a more optimistic presentation, Adil. Adil Ben Youssef, University of Nice, or Nice, Sophia Antiopolis. You specialize and you've worked on many reports dealing with new technologies, whether it's human capital development, strategy, science, technology, and innovation, digitalization of agriculture, and you're the negotiator of Tunisia on climate finance. So you can tell us about new growth opportunities. We've talked of some of the old growth opportunities that were not taken in the past and should be taken, but there seem to be new ones also, with new technologies and dealing with climate. Tell us a bit about that.
Thank you.
And can it change the equation?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much, Isaac, for inviting me to this panel. And I would like to thank the ERF for this wonderful organization. Yes, I have been working on two transitions, the ecological transition and the digital transition, since 25 years. And nowadays, we are trying to link them, both the two. We are convinced that the digital transition needs to serve the ecological transition. Otherwise, if they are not linked, we have not done anything. That's why twin transition is becoming high in the agenda, in the political agenda. And let me try to give some information about this. I would like to congratulate the researcher for the report, the quality of the report, the quality of the work done in a very short time, and also the 6 case studies were very, very interesting. I start by one clarification. And the clarification is about, as Isaac has presented me, I will try to be innovative in the way of looking at the problem. If you do design thinking, you have a problem, you look at the solution, but you need to come back again to see if it's the good problem that you are solving or not. And you need to do the interaction. So can we be innovative with our problems, not with our space of solutions? You have, sorry to present it very simply like this, someone earned $10,000, trying to go to the bank and ask for $15,000, and the bank said, no, it's not sustainable, your credit, your ratio, your income are not able to generate you. And you go because you are not able to borrow this money, you're not able to have this credit. But you come back and you say, sorry, I have not told you that my father have $1 billion, this is our wealth. He will reconsider the problem, because the wealth that you have is very important. And in the equation nowadays, when we are dealing with the EMF, we are not valuating our wealth. That means that, and this is the part, the innovative part, because we are speaking about GDP, debt, growth, but so many work have been done in order to reconsider this aggregate, to reconsider this, we need to put in the agenda also the capital, the natural capital, the resources that we have. Are we going to solve our problem by destroying our capital, natural capital? One example, in Tunisia, before that the French protectorate came to Tunisia, the Ministry of Agriculture had told me that we have 10 million hectares of forest. How many forests we have now in Tunisia? 800,000 only. We have destroyed 92% of our forest. This is development in 1.5 centuries. If we want to moderate the climate in Tunisia, we need to go back to this solution. So this is fantastic. We call this development. We need to value the capital, the natural capital, and we need to solve the problem without destroying the critical natural capital that we have. And I wonder that in the report, we can look at this seriously and evaluate it seriously. This is a political process, and Dr. Ibrahim, Mr. Prime Minister said that we need to play with all the cards that we have in our hand. This is one of the cards. When we look at the works of the EMF, let me say, for example, the works of Ralph Shami about the value of elephants, the value of whales, and their contribution to CO2 sequestration. So they are more innovative nowadays in looking at the problems than us. And the way of presenting I remember I was in my office and the guy of the Ministry of Environment in Tunisia asked me, saying, the EMF want to see us as the climate change unit. We are not able to deal with them. What we need to... But EMF are looking at what are we doing in the climate. Do we have a pipeline of projects, bankable projects, in order to define the new path of work? We have not done enough on this. And I think that really we need to respond to this crisis by not destroying our main health, main wealth. Dr. Shanta, Professor Shanta said water resources. Yes, we are not considering the optional value of water. We are making tomatoes with underground water. This is incredible. This is for exportation. We are exporting, so this is not development. The second thing that I would like to make is, yes, we can make sustainable growth. It's possible in our region. And this sustainable growth can be rich in employment opportunities and can serve the poor. Let me just focus on one sector. One of the biggest problems that we have in the region, waste management. But waste is wealth. This is wealth for the others. It's not waste, it's not a problem, it's a solution. We need to go to circularity, but it's not a slogan, circularity. This is what we need to do. We need not just small projects to showcase this is how it works. No, we need to, and we need to put it in the program of the reforms. We need to put it like we are going to circularity, we are going to this. And of course, if we are going seriously, it will create jobs. It will create so many jobs for the poor especially. So this is, but for that, you need a new generation of entrepreneurs. And this is the point. We need a new generation of entrepreneurs. We need to build a new generation of entrepreneurs that tackle technology, speak about sustainability, and these entrepreneurs, what they are doing in our region, they are facing administrative things. But they are flying from our region because of these things. So we have so many reforms internally in order to keep our main entrepreneur, and these entrepreneurs can tackle the issues. And I think we are not taking it seriously. I'm happy to see that the Nile University and the dean said that they are tackling this issue, but it needs to be scaled up. Another point is climate finance. Let me say 2 words about climate finance. Yes, we can do a new path of growth, new path when we tackle the climate seriously. And we are negotiating with our partners because, okay, we are in a weak position when you go to the EMF, but at the same time, the board of the EMF and the people from the other side, we are discussing them separately. they have caused this big damage. They have a commitment to give us $100 billion per year since 2020. We have not seen this money. This is a small portion of to resolve our problem, but this is at least need to be mobilized nowadays. And with this money, we need to go sustainable. We need to go to, and I think that the situation can be deblocked in the future. And the situation, we will have opportunity in matter of climate finance. But at the same time, I apologize to say in the region, we are not well prepared for this. We have not the pipeline of the projects. We are not ready for this. So we are asking, there is opportunities for money, but we are not, again, prepared. Lastly, we need a tax reform, and this is true. Development is tax. For me, development is not aid. Development is not to ask money from the others in order to, we need a tax reform. This is part of the social contract that we need to build together. We need to make our development but by our own taxes. We are not able nowadays, but we need to make it in 3 decades. Let me see how we can go. And one of these is we need to say a fiscal policy, but fiscal policy for sustainability, fiscal policy for environment, better environment. If you do this, people are willing to pay. But show them that you are investing in sustainability. And this is key. And I would like to finish with one proposal. I'm advocating this since so many years. Okay, we need to remove the energy subsidies because sustainability, because of it's not sustainable in any way. But at the same time, I am advocating for internet subsidies. Why? Most of the people, when they tackle poverty, they don't tackle this point. Why people are feeling poverty nowadays? Because if you look at the poorest of the poor, he has a mobile phone. He is investing in order to have internet, etc. And this budget is substituting his investment in education, health, and in food. So I think that we need to subsidize this because this is a new way to make sustainability for e-work, e-learning, e-any. And during the COVID, we have seen that this is needed. I think that really part of the sustainability can come from these e-activities if they are well designed. So this is, but at the same time, we need to change to show to the citizens that we are investing in sustainability, we are removing some subsidies, but we are putting new subsidies in areas that are pro-environment and pro-sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adi. So lots of opportunities with new technologies and with the realization of the value of the stocks of climate. Yeah. So we're going to move to Hafiz Ghanim, who is mostly senior fellow of many important institutions, the Brookings Institution, the Policy Center for the New South, my Finance for Development Lab, and most importantly, ERF. And previously, he had other minor jobs. He was the vice president of various regions at the World Bank for the Middle East, and then for all of Africa, and then for parts of Africa. And before that, he was a colleague of many years, country directors in, was it Madagascar? No. Yeah, and then Nigeria, and you were at the ILO, and we were at the World Development Report many years ago. Anyway, you have experience in so many countries, in so many fields, that I didn't get myself to ask you any particular questions. I thought you would you would talk about anything important that we haven't talked about yet.
Thank you, Saad. Thank you for remembering me this time around. Yes, I actually would like to talk about more issues of regional cooperation and regional integration. It was mentioned this morning by Ibrahim when he was presenting the report, but so far, yesterday and today, we have not gone into much detail in discussing it. And I think it is important for two reasons. One reason is that I think if we look at regional issues, we can come up as ERF with research programs and research ideas that could have much more of an impact. And that was to respond to the question that was raised in the first session. But it's also extremely important for us to look at regional issues because of what is happening in the world today. We are basically observing two phenomena. One is the deglobalization of the world. The deglobalization, the increase in great power competition, and that is driving many parts of the world to looking more at regionalization. So we're moving from globalization to more regionalization, which is not necessarily a good thing for the world as a whole, by the way, but I'm just stating it as a phenomenon, a fact that is happening now. The second change in the world that is especially affecting our region is that our region is becoming less important for the rest of the world. We need to face that fact. In the 20th century, the Middle East was central to the policies and politics of the great powers. Now it is more Asia. And the Middle East is much less important than before. So, faced with those two facts, I think it is important for the region to look at how can we do more regional cooperation. And my take at regional cooperation and developing at regional integration in MENA is not the old-fashioned way of, okay, let us do a trade liberalization among it, let's create a trade bloc and so on, because those things happen and they have very little impact. What I suggest really is that we identify important regional projects, important issues on which the countries of MENA can cooperate, and issues that also I would like to add that can be politically neutral, so that it will be easy for the countries to work together, even if the countries disagree on other things. So I have 5 points, but I'm not sure I'll be able to do them in 7 minutes, but I'll go very quickly. And if I fail to do all the points, I'll just mention them. The first area where the region can cooperate and should cooperate is on food security. We have a huge problem of food security in MENA. The region is more than half the calories that are consumed in MENA are imported, which is not necessarily a bad thing if we are able to make sure that the imports are coming through and are regular. What I think and it is very difficult for us to see how any single country in MENA can assure its own food security on its own. However, working together, the MENA countries can actually assure food security. And I would underline 4 points, 4 areas where they work together on food security. The first important area that we see very little done on it is on agricultural research. And it's not necessarily doing new pure research in agriculture, but it's actually implementing research that already exists around the world and adapting it, taking it and adapting it to the realities of MENA. Yields in this region are still too low. So there is a real ability to do more here. If you compare the amount of money that is being put in agricultural research in MENA with a country like Brazil, for example, we are at 25% of what the Brazilians are doing in terms of agricultural research. So that's the first area. Second area, I think that we can work on regional agriculture projects. Instead of trying to grow wheat in the desert and consuming tons and tons of water, we can work together to grow wheat in Sudan or in Iraq. Create really regional projects in a multilateral regional way. Fourth activity that is done is to go beyond the region, is to work internationally, to create and especially to work with Africa, for example. In East Africa, we have tons of opportunities so instead of having this high reliance on one source of imports of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, why can't we help develop more agriculture in Tanzania, in Kenya? And that can be done. Finally, we can also imagine a regional strategic reserve, a regional system of strategic reserves, so that when there is shortfall in one country, you can cover it. So this is one area where I believe we can do more research, where I believe the MENA should actually MENA countries should actually work together and to develop their food security. And food security is going to become an even more problematic issue in the future because of climate change. And that is the second point I wanted to raise, that our countries can work together much more and cooperate much more on climate change. Water was mentioned. On the adaptation side, we can develop projects for water, but we need also to look at projects dealing with the rise in seawater level. We have cities in MENA that are threatened by the rise in seawater level. Look at Alexandria, for example. Look at Algiers. So there is a lot of opportunities for working together. On the mitigation side, the big area is obviously energy. The development, I think some countries in MENA, and I'm thinking especially of Morocco and Egypt, have invested a lot in solar, and that is a good thing. But the next big thing is green hydrogen. Can we imagine a regional program, a regional project that as we move away from hydrocarbons and into green hydrogen, into more solar? But again, that's an area where we can work together. So climate change is another area. As a footnote, since you mentioned my green bank idea, as a footnote, I think that the MENA countries, and especially now that we had COP27 in Egypt, and we have having COP28 in the UAE, there is a big push around the globe for asking the World Bank to be financing the climate projects. And I think it's not a good idea. I think it's a bad idea for two reasons. The first reason is that this will undoubtedly imply that money for development, for health, education, and so on will be diverted for climate. And I thought that the northern countries that have created all of those greenhouse gases have promised that they will bring fresh money into that. And I think it's not a good idea also because of the governance structure of the World Bank, where there is not enough voice for countries of the South that are most impacted by the climate, and because and it does not have voice for civil society and the private sector. So what I've been proposing is to create a new international bank just for climate that will mobilize the money for climate, and I think actually many countries can take the lead in that, as they did take the lead in the 1970s for the creation of the International Food and Agriculture, the IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, which was created actually with the leadership from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, with the idea of channeling petrodollars into food security projects in developing countries. So that was the footnote. But so my second area, I think, where we can do a lot of is climate change. Now, third area, and don't look at me like that. Yes, I know.
Out of time, although these are great ideas.
Okay, I'll go much faster. The third area, which is on the digital economy, which you mentioned. You mentioned I believe that this is an area where we should have a MENA moonshot for on the digital economy, where you can develop a regional program that looks at digital infrastructure and connects all the digital infrastructure, digital education, creating platforms, new platforms, and you mentioned some of them. And I would, we mentioned platforms, private sector platforms, the fact that the region, everybody speaks Arabic, so you actually need to develop those new platforms and new pages in Arabic. And so that is really important, and especially government platforms. There was a lot, and I know Ellen will be talking about governance, but I've seen in many countries that the use of the internet to create transparency, and the use of the internet to give voice to people. And so you can think of, and of course, another important platform is the financial transactions and the financial platforms. But we have many examples. Actually, if you're talking about finance, you can look at what Kenya is doing. If you're looking about governance in general, look at what is happening in India. But that is an area, if we work on the infrastructure and education, developing the platforms and developing the legal framework, a uniform legal framework around the region. I'm not going to go in details because for the other 2 points, because you look like you can commit murder, but I just mentioned them. The second area where actually, and it's good because both Omar and Safa are here, and we had worked together for a while on the education, the need for a regional education agenda, and we had started that when Omar was Minister of Education in Jordan, and I don't know how it went, but there's a need. And fifth and last, and where we need regional cooperation, is to end conflicts. I mean, our governments should be able to get together and stop this horror that's happening in Sudan, in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya. And unless we stop that, how can we develop the region? Thank you. I'm sorry to talk too much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hafiz. So, I mean, we're starting to have really very full research agenda, lots of questions. And Ellen, you're going to help us think of how feasible this is. I've been, do we have Ellen on? Here you go. Good to see you. Let me introduce you first. So you are a professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Gothenburg. You have been at Yale University, at Rice, at the Institute of Graduate Studies in Geneva, at NYU, and you have wonderful publications. I've learned so much reading them. You probably have the most popular textbook on the Middle East also. So you're going to help us make sense of several things. We heard about a new social contract. I mean, that sounds ambitious, but I mean, that's a political adaptation to the new times. Can it happen? Other people speak more ambitiously even of a political settlement, a real adjustment to the new needs. We have heard yesterday a lot about veto players. You know, labor unions in Tunisia, bad bankers in Lebanon refusing to take losses, military companies in Sudan and in other countries. And Omar talked of how to kind of building trust one step at a time, a kind of a gradual virtuous circle, building momentum. How do you make sense of all of that? How do you see kind of political adjustment to the new economic realities, Ellen?
Great. So first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to comment on this and apologize for not being able to be there in person. I wish I was. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of discussion here that really relies on some sense of political will, some sense of kind of change of governance. I'm going to respond to how I've heard it in the comments, but also the reading of the report. I mean, thinking about things that will signal a decline in corruption, the better health and education, the kinds of success in processes and projects that are being putting out is if they're domestic or regional. In the report, you talk about how it's reliant on kind of the proactive engagement of economic elites, the kind of political will of leaders, and the civil society coming together. My first reaction, and it's unfortunate, is that it's wonderful and ideal and not necessarily what seems to be on the ground in terms of the makings of a kind of a political settlement for change. I'm going to leave aside the economic elites and just note a couple of things with regards to civil society and regards to sort of the kind of the state of reforms, right? So if we think about civil society, the sustainability index of the USAID, for instance, shows that 4 of the countries that are in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Libya, and Yemen, in 2021, ranked the lowest in terms of, they called them sustainability impeded, and that we had the next 4 were in the lower end of the next higher ranking, which was evolving. And that only 2 countries changed rankings in 2022, and those were Jordan and Lebanon, both of which dropped. In other words, despite or maybe even in part because of the Arab uprising in what was seen as the spring, right, what we've really seen is a decline in the ability of civil society to come to the aid for reform, right? So I'm not suggesting I'm sort of full of good news at the moment, or probably telling you anything you don't already know, but I think it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about what would create the sort of the conditions for change and what we might need to think through. The second sort of point that struck me, again, especially with regards to the report, was the kind of the trust put in the idea that political leaders would recognize the kind of the urgency and need for change and therefore be willing to put that into place. In some ways, I think we could argue that probably nowhere have we seen more kind of evidence of the need for change and for reform than we've seen in Lebanon in the last couple of years, right? That, it's considered to be one of the most drastic global economic changes since the mid-18th century is quite a statement. I'm sorry, mid-19th century. But what we also know is that, in March of this year, that there's sort of the IMF report basically noted it sort of and warned about the stalled reforms that we're seeing, right? That it's not necessarily just because the sort of the situation is dire, reforms are so necessary that we actually get the changes that are required. And that might be partly because of vertical trust, it might be partly because of horizontal trust, but it does call into question both what it takes to regain trust in processes that may be hard in moving forward, right? But I think also where does this where do the challenges to trust come from? And I want to come back to that for a moment, because I think to some extent, we get as many demands from citizens and from others for non-problematic policies as we get from simply the top down. It's not just about leadership, it's also about the demand side of this. And the final point I want to make in terms of things that kind of jumped out at me was and it's been mentioned a little bit in terms of the possibilities of looking at regional cooperation, the needs for cooperation on climate change, water, the things that Hafiz was just talking about a moment ago. I think those are very, very important. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the challenges that the sort of the Chinese presence brings into the mix, and that was, of course, discussed in the first, in Adnan's discussion about this. But it's really important to keep that in mind, because I think it changes how we might even think about sort of the potential strategies for change, not just the potential for change, right? But what are the strategies that can be used? So it's great to think about, signaling a decline in corruption, finding better governance, et cetera. But I want to put on the table what I think might be important to recognize or think about with regards to the causes of governance problems, and therefore what we might need to do in terms of solutions. So in actually a little book that I just put out, I talk about what I call everyday choices, right? The idea that when we're thinking about how, whether it's government officials or if it's citizens are responding to things like the potential for obtaining services, the need for government jobs and how those might be distributed, the ideas of putting into place policies and reforms, that to some extent this is within the realm of the state, and that's predominantly what all of you have been talking about and what has been kind of put on the table. But then when we're thinking about things like, corruption, we're thinking about things like why is it that, we have a lack of education and health outcomes that often don't match what's going on in terms of investment. I would argue it's because there are a lot of other demands that are being put on both political leaders and other senses of kind of lack of horizontal trust among citizens that really come into play. So one of the interesting things about Lebanon and historically has been that when it has the most economic crisis is when sectarianism and sectarian pressures, which tend to undermine good governance, actually come to the fore, right? And that's because when these sets of kind of safety nets, when the sort of the ability to get government jobs, or health, education, et cetera, become more restrictive and essentially kind of harder to do, then people want to call on these sort of other sets of ties, right? Community ties, family, kin, ethnicity and sectarianism, et cetera, in order to be able to obtain the resources and the services that they need, right? And so, Shanta, you talked about, kind of the need for a new social contract between the state and citizens. And while that's true, in a sense, there also needs to be recognized that there's several social contracts that exist, and that sort of reinterpreting and redesigning the social contract between the state and the citizens is just but one of them, right? It also needs to be combined with ways in which it either can become more difficult for these other sets of kind of personal and social ties to be driving who gets services, what kinds of businesses can be open in what types of places, et cetera, in order to solve the problems that we're talking about, right? Those sets of ties and linkages and preferences and obligations, if you will, need to be thought and taken into consideration. So what I want to put on the table is essentially thinking about the need to restore trust, both going back to very old ideas of citizenship and nation building, et cetera, right? But really trying to also to think about what kinds of instruments and reforms and institutions can be kind of put into play and strengthened in order to be able to break down the sort of the influence of these other ties. I think you're referring to that to some extent when you talk about the modernizing the state, right? But I think a lot more can be done to really, kind of dig into what that means. And the other part I would put on the table is a question about how much we should think about democratizing, kind of business and industry. It makes a lot of sense, and I fully agree with that. There's times that it slips into thinking about democratization kind of more generally, right? An argument that, what we've seen in the last decade is that, democracy is sort of really the only solution. I think we can want democracy for a lot of different reasons, and all of them can be very good, but I'm not entirely sure that democracy would solve the kinds of economic problems, or put differently, is even necessary to solve sets of economic problems that are on the table. And particularly in a period of time when we've got, the engagement of China, global backsliding, and other problems. To me, separating out what might be a very interesting and important political goal from what is needed in order to achieve the economic goals might be what we want to do. So I'll stop there, but again, thank you very much for sharing this and inviting me to respond.
Thanks a lot, Ellen. Okay, we have lots of issues on the table. You've been very patient. I've been a bad chair. I figured 7 times 5 is 35, but it's turned out to be 90. Right, time flies. How much time can we take? 10 minutes, very good. So let's go around the room, and then we'll have one quick response from each. So it's your time. We have Abla here, and then we can go up. If you want, say who you are, and try to be short, because we have 5-6 people.
Yes, Abla Abdul-Latif, Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. I just have a comment, and built in it actually is a question for Dr. Hafiz. You mentioned that the voice of the South is not heard, and this is why we have the entire imbalance. And I agree with you completely. And you suggested that there would be an international organization of some kind to focus on climate. Do you think it's going to work if it focuses on one specific topic? I think what we need is a bigger change. We need a new economic order, because the ones who are going to make the decisions on the climate are going to follow the same rules of the existing system, where money is talking, and the developed countries are the ones that have the upper hand. And this is why there was very poor handling of COVID, and also the climate unfairness that's observed in Africa and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Abla. We have here.
Thank you very much. This is Ahmet Aysan from Hamad bin Khalifa University from Qatar. All the speakers made very excellent comments and interventions. I just want to bring you to the title. In the title, there is a changing world order, and Mr. Hafiz has partly mentioned about it. It is as if the MENA region somewhat forgotten. And I will bring this issue to that issue, because that overhang, that issues we have been discussing it after 2008 crisis especially. But one of the arguments is that, and there is a very pessimistic conclusion, unfortunately. But at the same time, is it also the possibility that the region is not indebted enough? Because one way why MENA has been forgotten in the global scale is because there's not enough debt, in a sense that debt is a way of integration to the rest of the world. Because if you are indebted to another country, if you are indebted to IMF, World Bank, other places, some way or another, they will be more involved. They will be more at stake. So there could be another way of integrating to the world, and that could be one mechanism, as it has been discussed. Probably it will be through the wealth collateral, and these international institutions can play a role. And also one last thing that which has not been mentioned although in the first session. I mean, we all somewhat accuse the countries in the region, but at the same time, just yesterday, the Federal Reserve has increased the interest rate to 5%. And these issues are somewhat certainly related with these issues as well. So it will be good to have some sort of a global look on this.
That's for you,
Thank
I
you.
think. Thank you. We have Sharoch there. We have lots of great hands up, so let's go fast and listen to everyone.
This
Go
is Sharaf Fardoos, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, USA. This has been an excellent panel, very good discussion. One thing that was left out is population pressure. I think one thing that we know is MENA's population is rising very rapidly. They're forecast that by 2050 we surpass 650 million, while we have shortage of water, environmental issues, and so forth. The second issue is there is a gradual breakdown in international order in terms of international financial system, World Trade Organization, United Nations, Security Council. They're not working as they were intended to. And they have an effect on MENA, because MENA has many demands which goes beyond its borders and within its borders. And these problems have not been solved. They keep getting bigger. So there are things that are beyond the control of the politicians in the region. They're international in nature.
Thank you. The whole geopolitical situation. Omar and then Heba. تحت. And by the way, there are 4 great plenaries coming, and lots of these issues will be expanded there.
Thank you. This is a great panel, and I just want to push and ask a question about growth and employment elasticity. This is not an incidental or a minor issue in the region. Unemployment is perhaps politically, economically, and socially the most important, if I may say, political factor affecting the region. So my question is, how far, and I want to push this panel, how far do we go Keynesian? Can we go, do we have the justification to go Keynesian on this? In other words, not just talk about the demand side and stimulating the demand and growth will create jobs, but really have an active role of the state. We've been talking about forestation, we've been talking about recycling, we've been talking millions of things where actually there is value for added employment, but the market isn't there. And these are things that the state can do. So not just what Keynes talks about where one group digs trenches and the other one, but literally in Jordan, youth are losing not just their employability skills, but their life skills, because when you're not working, you get up at 1 in the afternoon and you go to bed at 3 a.m. and then drugs and all sorts of. So this is an asset. This is a national asset that we are losing. I cannot just say hopefully demand will pick up at some point and our policies and will employ people. So I'm a bit passionate about this, right. But I would really like to hear from everybody.
Thank you. Pass the microphone to Heba behind you. Can we be Keynesian when we have very high debts?
I was delighted with Chantal's advice. Okay, I think it's very relevant to the region and the whole lot of us countries in trouble, which is to move much, much harder on the employment elasticity, and especially with regards export orientation. And if I just give you the example of Egypt, Egypt has had cotton forever. It's had public sector which has been privatized and available for the private sector to exploit, and yet we are exporting ready-made garments, which are the most labor-intensive and women-friendly industry, less than 5% of what Turkey, which is similar in size and history, less than 5% of ready-made garments that Turkey's made. So we can make it very easily, very fast, but then we go back to the enabling environment in terms of industrial zones, in terms of cluster support, etc. But I think this is really the route, and it's the fastest route because the people who will get the jobs are there waiting for the jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Basim, behind you.
Just quickly, I come from the private sector. There is no such thing as a private sector. It's not an entity. It's not organized. So you just need the state to leave room for the private sector to invest. And the way you do that is to provide not debt, but much more credit. Locally denominated currency credit, not foreign denominated credit. The United States grew on booms and busts of credit. You need to provide a much bigger space for banking credit independent from state-dominated stakeholders.
Okay.
When you provide that, we might have a chance at a higher growth pattern.
Thanks. We have 2 here and 1 here, 3 more, and then we'll be back to you. More credit.
Khalid Abu Ismail from ESCO. Thanks for the excellent panel presentations and discussion. I think being also a student of Lance Taylor, the work he's done on stabilization comes to mind, and his main comment was that it's relatively easier to do stabilization than structural adjustments. That's the first point, and that not all stabilization experience would lead to growth. And the third issue that I remember from all of the macro discussions back then was that inequality plays a huge role in determining the outcomes of stabilization and structural adjustments, economic reform in general. And one of the main features of the Arab growth stylized facts has been that it hasn't led to growth, the macro growth that you see, the GDP per capita, which is much less than the GDP because of population growth. When you compare it with the household income growth that you get from the surveys, there's a huge gap. And I think that's the elephant in the room, is that there's been growth even at the macro level that hasn't been transmitted, or 30% of that on average gets transmitted to households. And a lot of it might be because of these distributional issues. And I think the issues raised, that Shanta raised on the distribution, the employment elasticities are very important. But just a minor remark on that, and an important one, is we don't really have a problem with the employment elasticities per se, but with the decent work elasticities. Employment elasticities are not bad, but it's the problem with growing informality and growing decent work. And it goes back to Dr. Heba Handous's comments. These reform experiences were not able to raise productivity or raise export. That's why you don't get the J-curve. That's why you don't get the positive structural transformation returns. And that goes back to the basic question. Governance reforms for what? And I think the issues raised by Hafiz and others on industrial policies, I think it's really time for us to go back to the basic question. How do we get the Arab economies to be generating decent employment and raising their productivity at a rate that allows us to make this transition? These are the key questions, and I think I'd like to hear your point on them. Sorry for the long.
Thank you. Wonderful comments.
Hi, quick short question. Ahmed Ashar from Anwar Diplomatic Academy. My question to Shanta regarding the employment effect of the public employment. So for the countries that can afford the public employment, so some ideas being suggested: stop the jobs, cancel it, and go for universal basic income. So myself, I don't like it, but I would like to take your feedback on this.
Thanks. And last but not least, Muhammad Ali.
Thank you. Muhammad Ali Marwani, Sorbonne University and ERD. I like very much the idea of Shanta of bond linked to governance with this interest rate as an incentive to. But once this said, all the difficulty is who will decide what are the rules? Will it be insiders or outsiders? And what do we put in this? For example, of course, there are the macro things, but we could also put some ideas of Adel bin Yusuf about protecting natural resources, it could be democracy. I mean, it could be plenty of things, and of course, the more we will put, the more it will be difficult. But I think the idea is worth discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, one last, Madam.
Just following up what I heard from Dr. Khalid Ismail, I remember when we started this structural investment process since the 80s, we had something called structural adjustment with a human face. And there has been books or even reports on that. We didn't hear about that anymore when we are again doing structural adjustment. So we were talking about education, training, employment, pro-poor investment, and equity, which has been mentioned now by Dr. Ismail. So why don't we look at structural adjustments with a human face in particular, that we have so negative impact now on our society or on the people now?
Thank you. I mean, clearly I hear a lot of energy in the room for reopening and dealing with new issues. So I take this mostly as comments, although there were some questions. And just because lunch is coming, I'm going to be a chair finally and give you no more than 2 minutes each on my watch. You pick, the answer you feel, the question you want to answer. So let's start with you, Adnan, and move down.
Thank you very much. I'll respond to the question about debt and the Fed. There was a suggestion that maybe we don't have enough debt in this among the set of countries that we're discussing. I think this set of countries have too much debt, and they haven't even used what they've used, borrowed properly. And trying to raise more debt, making yourself more vulnerable, such that you become a bigger nuisance to the rest of the world, and then they may pay us attention, is maybe not the good way to go. Second, on the Fed, you're absolutely right. The Fed raises rates, and it does affect the rest of the world. We could criticize the Fed for having not moved enough quickly. We could criticize the Fed for previously having injected too much liquidity, but the Fed is responsible essentially for the performance of the American economy. It has spillovers, but that's a fact of life. It's not fair maybe, but the rest of us should adjust our systems to cope with those better, including moving to more flexible exchange rates to allow other shock absorbers handle the pressures. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pick Omar's question and agree with him on everything except to call it a Keynesian stimulus. Do not use that word, because for the reason that Heba said it. What Heba described was an employment policy to increase the elasticity of the growth elasticity of employment using pure neoclassical principles. Liberalize trade so that you can export more. And that's where you get the employment. So I'm not sure that just government spending, which is what the Keynesian solution is what we're looking for. We're looking for policies, and usually it's the removal of policies rather than imposition of policies that will enable the entrepreneurs in the MENA region to create jobs. And we can do that. I mean, other countries have done it in spades. And I would say it's not just the garment industry, but we can be thinking of services, service exports now, which are a big thing, because you have an educated population, you have an educated labor force, you can actually do it. But that's good old-fashioned neoclassical trade policy. You don't need Lance Taylor to tell you about industrial policy for this. This is what we've been trying to do for a long time. Unfortunately, in this region, we haven't succeeded.
Yes, thank you. Let me start by trying to respond to Abla's question. I would like to separate two things. First, yes, there is a need to change the governance of the international financial system. There's a need for governance reforms, but it's going to be very difficult to bring about. It's a zero-sum game. But I believe that we need to continue pushing for the governance reforms at the World Bank, IMF, and so on. And it's not just for MENA. I think actually I was doing, for all the global south, especially for Africa, which is, Africa has the largest, is the largest recipient of funds from the World Bank, and it has the smallest voice on the board of the World Bank. So there is something. However, so that is something that we need to do, but having this other, creating this other institution to deal just with climate change, to protect the resources for climate, but also to protect the resources for development, and also to try to start a new institution with a different governance structure and show that how this governance actually can work, I think would be a good idea. Very quickly, on Shahruk's point on population, I think it is very important to talk, to think about population. I personally don't believe, because of my experience in population policies. I believe more that what is needed in this region is women's empowerment. If you keep the girls at school, if you ensure jobs for women, then they will decide to have their children later, and they will on their own, therefore, like we see all around the world, deal with the population issue. It should. I don't think that we economists can work on that. Am I at 2 minutes?
2 minutes or 7. So you're right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will start when you have finished on population also. Yes, the problem of the population can lead me to discuss one of the key problems of our growth is since we have a lot of people coming, we need to make this urbanization. But we are in a region where the urbanization have not served the growth. This is what we call the puzzle of the urbanization. We are in one of the regions that, because we are not making in a rational way our how can say, towns, the urban planning, the things, and this decreases the growth. And really, we need to think this differently. The second element with the population, we are in a land where we are going to host a lot of climate refugees. And we need to think about the climate refugees because it will be a destabilization also. It's coming, this crisis. And it may come very, very seriously and rapidly. And finally, I would like just an advice for the team, is to consider to go beyond the GDP. We need the reflection on happiness. Are we more happy because we have more? This is not true. So we need to have indicators in the report about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen, you have the last word.
I think my last word will be to say thank you to everybody. This is really interesting, and I've appreciated it very much. And I know I'm keeping everyone from lunch, so I'm going to let you go and say thank you again.
Thank you, Ellen. Well, thank you all. So really, we've gone from that report, we've opened up the issues, and now we have wonderful panels that would take each one of these block and issue of issues and explore them in much more detail. So more to come. Thank you to the speakers, to you, and let's have lunch.
Thank you, sir. Well done.